Greetings, everyone. My name is Jeremy Halton, and this is an introductory lecture for Theology 621, a unit focused on the historical study of Jesus and the Gospels. This brief first lecture is really just to do two things. One, to orient us as to the subject matter of the semester's study, and particularly to address what we mean by saying we're looking at Jesus and we're looking at the Gospels. It might be unclear why those would be two conceptually distinct categories. Second, we're calling this historical study of Jesus in the Gospels. What's the historical part mean? And sometimes you'll hear this called the historical critical method. What about our methodology needs to be said at the outset? To begin with, to state a few things that probably don't need saying, but everyone is perhaps coming to this unit from different backgrounds. Not everyone has studied in the same places. So to make sure we're all on the same page, there's a New Testament, 27 books, and we call it the New Testament because there's an Old Testament, what Jews would call the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament consists of the law, the prophets, and the writings. These are three main categories. Already in antiquity, they're described this way, and the Hebrew words are Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, whence we get the Jewish expression for the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. The New Testament consists of similar clusters. We have four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We've got the book of Acts, which is really just the second volume of the Gospel of Luke. And so we in this class will tend to study Luke Acts as a two-volume unity, letting one passage from the book of Acts comment on the book of Luke and so on and back and forth. The New Testament also consists of a lot of letters, usually called epistles. 13 are ascribed to the Apostle Paul. One is anonymous, the Epistle of the Hebrews, and then there's 7 Catholic epistles, James and Jude and 2 Peter and 1 Peter and so on. The New Testament concludes with the Apocalypse of John, more commonly known as the Book of Revelation. This semester we are not going to concern ourselves almost at all with the epistles or Revelation. Moving along, we've got an Old Testament, a Tanakh. It's important to remember that no one in the period we will be studying thinks of this as the Old Testament. It is just Scripture. And there's no one for whom this is more true than the main subject matter of our semester, Jesus of Nazareth. By all accounts, according to all sources, Jesus spends quite a bit of his time engaging in analysis of, interpretation of, teaching about Scripture, the Tanakh. The other main subject matter of our semester is, of course, the Gospels, and we will devote the vast majority of our time to the 4 canonical Gospels. Now, these are books about Jesus, and in some sense also about Jesus and his first followers with the book of Acts. Things begin to get a wee bit more complicated, and this is the sort of thing we will be looking at during the semester, because whereas Jesus was an Aramaic speaker and was probably capable of reading or understanding Hebrew, and so he's having discussions about Tanakh with other Aramaic-speaking Jews in Galilee in the Hebrew or Aramaic language. More about whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic on another day. When our gospel writers write, they all write in a different language. They write in Greek. And even when they tell the story of Jesus quoting a passage from Scripture, whereas Jesus surely quoted it in a Semitic language, they draw their quotation from the Greek Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible had been translated into Greek over a period of centuries, beginning in the 3rd century BC. And it had generally a high level of status and authority among most varieties of Judaism. It certainly did so for Christians. So already we have a bit of a complication, because the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible are not identical. And so there will be times when Jesus, in good early sort of Jewish rabbinic fashion, makes a pun on a word in Scripture, and he's punning on the Hebrew. It's going to be very hard for a gospel writer to represent that same pun when they're using a quotation drawn from a different language. Furthermore, there are sometimes substantial differences between the Greek Old Testament that they're reading and the Bible Jesus will have been reading. One important thing to say at the outset is that authors like Luke did not write their gospel so it could sit alongside Matthew, Mark, and John in a volume called the New Testament. Bear in mind that This threefold organization of Scripture, the law, the prophets, and the writings, well, the category of the writings was rather loose in the period we're concerned with. And especially in the Greek scriptures, books were added to this, such as the Book of Judith, the Book of Tobit, sort of pious novelistic legends about great Jewish figures. There was important Jewish history that was included. So in the 2nd century BC, the Jews revolted against their Greek overlords. This is the Maccabean Revolt and the dynasty of the Hasmoneans. This story is told in 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees. In addition, there are other writings in Greek and in Aramaic, like 1st Enoch, that although they were not part of the Septuagint, were enormously influential in ancient Judaism and in early Christianity. So when someone like Luke is writing, and he writes in the biblical style of Greek, the Septuagintal style of Greek, there's a sense in which he's not writing so that his gospel will sit alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's writing in the same way that 1st Maccabees or 2nd Maccabees or Judith are writing. He's saying, aha, another great child of Israel has arisen, and I need to tell his story to add to the annals of God's activity with the world. That's why Judith writes, that's why Tobit writes, that's why 1st Maccabees writes. Luke, in a sense, mimicking this style, wants his books to be part of this ongoing story. And 1st Enoch is included here because this is a book that Luke also is going to some degree, be aware of some of its theology, some of its predictions, and he draws on that in some clear ways, as do other writers in the New Testament. So when we have a twofold Bible with a Hebrew Bible and a New Testament, it's important to remember when we read the New Testament, the authors who wrote the New Testament were reading more books than are the books included in our Hebrew Bible. And that's one of the reasons it's absolutely essential for the study in this semester to have a study Bible that includes the so-called Apocrypha. And again, in the 1st century, these weren't called Apocrypha. They were just considered authoritative books detailing what things God had done for Israel. I want to say a word now about what it means to think about the study of Jesus being distinct conceptually from the study of the Gospels. After all, the Gospels are about Jesus. So let's start with the basics. We have Jesus, who's active more or less in the years 30 to 33. He is interpreting Tanakh, as are lots of other Jews in his time. He interacts with them, argues with them, wins some over as followers, so on and so forth. We have the Gospels. These are written about 30, 40, 50 years later. We'll talk more about how that dating is arrived at later on. Obviously, an important question is going to be, between the time of Jesus and the time the Gospels are penned, how is information about Jesus transmitted to them? What are their sources? That will be the subject of a subsequent lecture, but this includes, at the very least, stories that sometimes circulated independently, like an individual episode. One day there was a woman accused of adultery, and then Jesus said, blah, blah, blah. That story circulates on its own. There are sayings, which likewise sometimes circulate independently. They're passed on orally, they're passed on in written form as well. We're going to explore all of this later. We have information about this time period in Paul's letters. Paul only quotes Jesus in very few places. Those quotations are precious because they're actually the very earliest tangible quotations we have, but he doesn't say much about Jesus of Nazareth. And so Paul's letters in many ways are most important for this semester because they give us evidence about the sociological and theological character of this movement. They tell us about the types of people who were transmitting Jesus material. Arguably, we have a collection of sayings which is given the siglum, the signifier Q. We'll say more about that when we give a lecture on the synoptic problem. Q is a hypothetical document, but there are good arguments for its existence, so something we don't have anymore, but which was quite possibly drawn on by Matthew and Luke. There, of course, may have been eyewitnesses. The time span is not prohibitive, and early church tradition wants to claim that Mark wrote his gospel at the instruction of Peter. and that Matthew is sometimes accredited with being one of Jesus' disciples. This is much disputed, but is by no means impossible and has been defended by some of the best scholars working today. We will analyze the pros and cons of that argument. Finally, it's possible that Mark is not the first to write a complete narrative, what we call a gospel. And so we'll address that question. In the earliest church fathers who talk about the origin of the gospels, there is something called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which is usually credited with being the first. If that's the case, it's something we don't have anymore. Anyway, more than we need to say about this. Somehow, transmission of material comes from the time of Jesus of Nazareth to the time the Gospels that we have are written. Now, the distinctive subject matters of this unit are going to be the literary analysis of the Gospels, where we don't so much worry what did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get right or wrong in every case. We will rather be focusing on analyzing them in their own terms. And so while we will at times say, Luke has slightly has gotten this fact exactly right, confirmed by an inscription, or it looks like Luke's got his date wrong here, we may say that, but we'll be much more interested in saying, so why does Luke put his genealogy in chapter 3? Why does Luke put the ripping of the curtain in the temple at a slightly different point than Mark puts it? What's Luke trying to say about this story? We want to analyze these authors in their own terms. And in that sense, as we read them, we'll be more interested in the Septuagint, the Bible they're reading, that they're interacting with. When they want to quote a prophecy and say Jesus fulfilled it, 8 times out of 10, they're quoting the Septuagint version. So we won't really be worried with the more original Hebrew version of the Bible, the one Jesus was using. We want to analyze them on their own terms. You get the point, and we'll say more about it as we go along. So there's literary analysis of the Gospels. There's also the so-called question of the historical Jesus. And in this case, we won't really be that interested in the Septuagint, which he doesn't seem to have had much to do with. When we're worried about the historical Jesus, we will be asking, in his lifetime, what did this or that episode mean? The classic example here, which could illustrate the distinction between these two types of analysis, would be something like the episode where Jesus cleanses the temple or drives the sellers out of the temple. All of our sources report that. And by the canons of critical historiography, Jesus did something like this. In fact, it seems to be what precipitated his arrest. Furthermore, the gospel writers all handle it slightly differently. So the Gospel of John, for instance, places the episode in the temple early on. It's one of the first things that happens in Jesus' ministry. It's in John chapter 2. And Jesus explains the temple is his body. The other Gospels all put this at the end of Jesus' activity, and it's again what precipitates his arrest. Most people think they're right. When we're doing the literary analysis of the Gospels, when we come to the Gospel of John, we're not going to so much be preoccupied with when that episode happened. We're going to say, John, given your symbolic world, why do you place this story here? What does it mean? How does it resonate with other aspects of your story of Christ? Similarly with the case of the Gospel of Luke, Luke and Acts treat Jesus' activity in the temple rather differently. Luke has a rosy view of the temple throughout his gospel. Jesus is received there warmly by the aged Simeon and Anna in chapter 2. Jesus is found there as a prodigious 12-year-old, and he tells his parents, you should have known to look for me here. This is my home. Luke, in fact, has Jesus' threatening comments about the temple reserved for the book of Acts. And there they are represented as being false accusations against Jesus' followers. Why has Luke distanced these sayings, these threats against the temple from Jesus himself? Well, we're going to figure that out in terms of Luke's own theology and Luke's own approach. When we come back to the historical Jesus, we want to ask about what would be the most likely criticisms someone would lodge against the temple in the 30s. There's, of course, a great difference between Jesus' own day and the time the Gospels are written. Namely, the temple is still standing and operational in Jesus' day. When John is writing, the temple lies in ashes. The Romans burnt the temple to the ground in the year 70, and it would be very hard to write a story about your hero threatening the temple with the knowledge that the temple was then destroyed without that fact somehow affecting how you depicted the original event. When we come to thinking about Jesus' activity, we have to block out of our mind what we know, that the temple was later destroyed. The gospel accounts intimate that there was some sort of objectionable financial activity, that according to John, the temple had been turned into a house of business. Is that something Jesus would have likely objected to? And did other Jews complain about that? Were temple prices extortionate? Were there other cultic reforms in the 30s that bothered people? Those are the sorts of questions we'll ask when trying to make sense of, why did Jesus make this big production in the temple, this big demonstration? What was his point? You get the rough idea of how we'll make this sort of distinction. And likewise, when we find a saying in the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, which for various reasons is deemed quite unlikely to be authentic to Jesus, we'll say more about how those decisions are made later, such a saying will be of enormous relevance for understanding Matthew or John or wherever else the saying appears, but we will have to keep them out of view when we analyze Jesus, and we'll try to restrict ourselves to the episodes in his life or the sayings that have good, credible historical grounds for being attributed to him. Now, what about this area in the middle, the transmission of the material? There are a few things to say about this here, and we're going to devote a whole lecture to this time period and this material. So here we'll just say a word. Early Christians, like early ancient Jews, like everyone in the ancient world, thought orality was better than writing, and so naturally they passed on stories about Jesus, sayings about Jesus, for the most part, orally. One thing we will want to keep in mind when we think about this period, when sayings and stories are being transmitted, is what were the events in early Christianity that might have affected how they transmitted that material. One hypothesis which we will have to wrestle with is that as there are traumatic events in the life of the community of Jesus' followers, that affects how they pass on the stories. And so Paul's letters here, again, are precious because they tell us about the development of Christianity. They tell us what the controversies were, how the theology developed. One thing that Paul's letters make abundantly clear is that Paul understands Jesus to be a cosmic figure, the Son of God, sent at an appointed time, pre-existent, Lord of heaven and earth. And some people would say that that idea about Jesus that we find in Paul is alien to the historical Jesus, and that the movements Paul led completely misunderstood Jesus, who was merely this humble peasant who had some clever witticisms, engaged in a bit of typical proto-rabbinic banter. Paul badly misunderstood him, and then the Gospels come along and they try to take the Jesus Christ that they know from Paul's communities and write a story about him. Now, if that's true, then the Gospels are quite unreliable when they depict Jesus having something like a messianic self-consciousness. That's a serious gauntlet thrown down that has to be wrestled with. Many critical historians don't buy that portrait, and we'll talk about why in the future. I want to conclude by saying a word about this historical study of the Bible, sometimes known as historical critical study. This may be old hat for many of you, but in case it's not, it's worth saying a word. The main heading I want to have here is that historical study is meant to be comparative, not anti-theological. It's often experienced as anti-theological. If you're used to reading the Bible devotionally or in church for spiritual guidance, the way we're going to approach it will be somewhat alien, because we're going to be asking questions about what things meant in their original time, and not primarily questions about what to do with it. That's not meant to deprecate the latter type of question. We could just take some examples to put some flesh on this. We're going to see Jesus arguing with the Pharisees about the right interpretation of the law. There are historical questions we can ask, and there are questions of application or devotion or spirituality. We are going to be focused on the left-hand column, questions like, what was the Jewish law like in Jesus' day? And who were the Pharisees? Why did they interpret the law differently? Questions of application would be such as, how do I avoid the sort of legalism Jesus is talking about? That is an entirely valid question. And in my opinion, The answer to the left-hand column may very well have some impact on how you answer the right-hand column. But in this class, we're only going to be worried about the left-hand column, partly so that people who aren't interested in applying this to their lives, who are just curious about the history, can also fully engage. To give other examples, we take a saying like Matthew 5:39, Jesus says, "Turn the other cheek." Historical questions would include, how common was nonviolent resistance? Interestingly, there are several really important Jewish episodes just before Jesus' time where Jews attempted nonviolent resistance, actually to great effect. So Jesus isn't exactly the innovator of this teaching. Historical questions would be, is this an authentic saying of Jesus? Usually people think it is, but that's an historical question. Questions of application, again, really important questions, but different ones. Does this a policy of nonviolent resistance work? Does it give evil a free rein in the world? What shall we do if we see a third party being hurt? We can't just turn our own cheek then. Do we intervene? Very important questions that Christians and theologians and ethicists have wrestled with through the ages, but not our main concern in this unit. Finally, for a slightly different sort of problem, take an historical statement. Luke 2:2. Luke says, this was the first census that was taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. This is how Luke dates the birth of Jesus. An historical approach will be somewhat different here than a faith-based approach. An historical approach will be inclined to say, boy, oh boy, that looks like an error of dating, because we know pretty well when Quirinius was governor of Syria. We know when and why he took a census. We know how censuses worked. And none of this really fits. It's the wrong date for Jesus' birth, and it wouldn't make sense for Jesus' parents to go to Joseph's ancestral homeland. That's not what happened. This is a mistake. It's not the biggest mistake in the world. It's not that, it's not that drastic, but it's wrong. A faith-based approach, well, there's more than one. You may say, we should give Scripture the benefit of the doubt. How do we know that maybe there weren't multiple censuses under Quirinius and that maybe he had a longer career of governor of Syria than other sources let us know? And a faith-based approach might also say something different, like, okay, it's a minor mistake, but that's irrelevant to the inspired message that Scripture gives. There is going to be a bit more of a rub with questions like miracles. An historical approach and a faith-based approach will be different. And here there's really more than one historical approach. Above and beyond anything else we say, an historical approach will be comparative. So when thinking about Jesus making a blind man see, we'll want to say, how common were reports of that sort of miracle in the first century? Answer, the Emperor Vespasian is reported to have made a man blind from birth see, according to the Roman historian Suetonius. So above and beyond anything else, we're just going to do comparative analysis. Were Jesus' methods similar? Were the reactions similar? And so on and so forth. Now, in sort of an old-fashioned historical approach, there's the presupposition, perhaps not an unreasonable one, miracles don't happen, so we've got to come up with some explanation of what really happened. And so people will say, oh, these were early myths, or I don't know, there's various explanations. This whole sort of approach is quite out of favor these days among historians. Most historians are just sort of they put off the question of what actually happened. Was there something supernatural? They just don't try to pull back the veil on that. They're agnostic about that. And you will find now, among most historians, just descriptions like Jesus was a wonder worker. They're not actually insisting they think Jesus did things that are supernatural, but that's what they regard as his appropriate job description. They would also say the Emperor Vespasian was a wonder worker among the things he did. And then you just try to get at, as best you can, anthropological analysis of what societies are like, how these sorts of stories are spread, what impact they have on their followers. Obviously, a faith-based approach to Jesus' miracles is going to be open to the supernatural in principle. And what I would want to note here is that a faith-based approach is still going to have to ask hard questions. After all, Christians have not just the stories about the miracles in the Gospels, they're also going to say things like, oh yeah, and When God took Jesus' mother Mary bodily to heaven, God also raised all the apostles out of their tombs and brought them together so they could watch Mary being taken into heaven. Do you believe that happened? If you accept a faith-based approach, you've got to be open to it in principle, but if you say you don't think it happened, why not? And if you give some answer for why you don't think it happened, you have to sort of apply that also to some of the stories in the Gospels. Final word here is just to say that for some people who take this unit, there's going to be some ways we approach Scripture that may feel like it runs roughshod over what you may be used to thinking of as Holy Scripture. And I would just encourage you, if that's your situation, to think about the way Orthodox Christianity thinks about the person of Christ, because I think this provides a useful model for thinking about an historical approach to Scripture. Chalcedonian Orthodox Christianity says that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And these aren't separate things. Jesus' divinity isn't a matter of him being somehow not fully human. So, just to make an absurd thought experiment, if a doctor inspected Jesus of Nazareth, a physician inspected him and said, well, I've done my check, turns out he's a man. A Christian response should not be, oh no, I thought he was the Son of God. A Christian response would be, actually, yes, we knew he was fully a man. There are other reasons we think he is the Son of God, and they have nothing to do with an absence of his humanity. If that's the Orthodox model for thinking about Jesus of Nazareth, then I think it's a useful model for devotional approaches to wed an historical critical approach to a devotional approach. When we look at these Gospels, we will see they use some of the same methods that other first century narrative writers use. That can initially be sort of a moment of disappointment for the devotional reader who says, oh shoot, I thought these were inspired texts, but it turns out they're narratives just like other first century narratives. But why draw that conclusion? You could also say, of course, they're fully human stories. That doesn't mean necessarily they're not inspired stories. That may or may not be of any use to you, but I think it could be a model that is helpful. This is just an introductory lecture to explain the subject matter of the unit and a bit about what historical critical method means, and to make clear that we're not trying to be anti-theological or disparage devotional, theological, ethical questions. They're just not the primary subject matter of this unit.